Good afternoon. My name is Olabode Ayola, Master Student in International Relations, and I'll be talking on realism stroke neorealism. What do we mean by realism? As in, realism is a group of theories that we can see they emerged in the United States after the Second World War, and they focus on the causes of violent conflict, which makes realism a relatively narrow theory. And this realism it tends to ignore the basis for peace and justice, which is described by the English school and liberal institutionalism. There was especially true during the Cold War, when realism provided the main guide for the U.S. foreign policy. So therefore, there are two major schools of realist thought, which we can say they are the classical realism and the structural realism. And also, there are some numbers of assumptions concerning the world we live in, and one of them is statism, which makes realism very different from the pluralist model of international relations, which was proposed by the English school, and it helps to define the realist approach to understanding international relations. And this leads the realists to focus on the role of states in their analysis of international events, and they ignore the influence of non-state actors. So also the second one is realism emphasizes the anarchic nature of the international system, and the English school and liberal institutionalists accept that there is no supreme ruler or judge who can settle international disputes. And realists of all stripes identify survival as the main goal of any state on the international stage, and all other goals must be subordinated to the quest for survival. Um, Realism maintains that only power can ensure a state's survival in the international system, and all other goals must be subordinated to the quest for survival, even if it requires violating key aspects of international law. Thirdly, all realists agree that a state can only ensure its own survival through self-help or self-help strategies that allow them to defend themselves and their interests against another state's aggression. Um, Realists reject the liberal concept of harmony of interest shared by all international actors, and question the sustainability of alliances over the long term. After all, history is littered with examples of allies turning on each other as soon as the threat that united them is gone. And this is precisely what happened when the United States and the United Kingdom split from the Soviet Union after the threat of the Nazi Germany and the Imperial Japan extinguished. As there are two classes of realism, which is the classical and the structural realism, we can say classical realism was the first branch of the realist thought to emerge following the end of the Second World War, starting with the work of Hans Morgenthau, because it and argues that the states pursue power and security at one other's expense, which is following the footsteps of Thomas Hobbes, which is the classical realist, which asserts that human nature holds the key to understanding war and conflict. And on this basis, they concluded that war is a natural product of flawed human nature, which is operating in an ungoverned and therefore in an ungoverned system, and therefore insecure international environment. And each state must rely on their own power to defend themselves against every other state in the international system. Um, Structural realism, we can say the structural realists use the security dilemma to explain the persistence of conflict and war on the international stage, and this focuses less on human nature and more on anarchic structure of the international system in which the states operate. Kenneth Watts argues that one state's efforts to ensure its survival will threaten the security of states around it, and the only rational course of action for a state in an anarchic international system is to maintain enough military and political power to defend itself against invasion. So, if you want to talk about neorealism, you can say neorealism is an attempt to translate the insight of classical realism into the language and method of modern social science. In the theory of international politics in 1979, Watts argued that most of the important features of international relations could be explained solely in terms of anarchical structure of the international system. And Watts argued that the traditional realist arguments about domestic institutions, the equality of diplomacy and statecraft, national morale, and human nature were all largely irrelevant. So, in conclusion, Watts argued that the most stable arrangement was bipolarity, which is or a balance between two great powers, and the international system is defined by its own continuity across space and time. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.